Welcome to the Tempo Storm Wild Meta Snapshot Breakdown. This is the final meta snapshot before the next expansion goes live. With Rise of Shadows on the horizon, it'll be interesting to see how the new cards will impact the Wild meta. Typically, the new expansions don't offer as much to Wild as it does to Standard, but sometimes a few broken cards will entirely flip the game around. Let's not get ahead of ourselves though, as we still have a few weeks left before the new expansion is released. It's interesting to note that Tier 1 is much thinner in this meta snapshot, as the meta shifts to answer the top decks. Before we take a look at the best decks of the current format, make sure you're subscribed to the channel in order to keep up with our Hearthstone content. Now let's jump right into Tier 1. Kingsbane Rogue remains at the top of Tier 1 in this meta snapshot. The deck continues to prove that it is powerful and versatile. It is the highest power level deck currently, and in some ways, the meta has warped around it. In order for other decks to compete for a spot in Tier 1, they need to at least have an average matchup against Kingsbane Rogue. This deck can relentlessly apply pressure and has the tools to resupply when needed. Kingsbane Rogue has a lot of good matchups, but its best one is against Big Priest. Being able to be so aggressive early while having sap to deal with the Priest threats make this matchup very good for the Rogue. Kingsbane Rogue does well against most archetypes, but due to its grip on the meta, a few more aggressive decks have risen to try to keep it down. Odd Paladin and Tempo Mage are two decks that do well against Kingsbane Rogue, and have both seen an increase in play rate due to this. Next up on the tier list is Odd Paladin. This deck rose to popularity as an answer to the extremely threatening Kingsbane Rogue. Odd Paladin is a very consistent deck, and has several different synergies that it can use to close out a game. Odd Paladin might not be the hardest deck to pilot, but make no mistake, the deck is a real threat. As mentioned before, Odd Paladin preys on Kingsbane Rogue. This is one of the best matchups for the Odd Paladin, and is the main reason to play the deck at all. As an added benefit, you can also beat Tempo Mage, which is seeing more play due to Rogue. Odd Paladin struggles against decks that can easily deal with their boards, and aren't afraid of the Paladin's pressure. For example, Even Warlock and Cube Warlock are both really good decks against the Paladin for this reason. After the Warlock clears their board, they are safe to establish their own threats to lock the Paladin out of the game. The final deck in Tier 1 this time around is Even Warlock. Even though this deck isn't favored against Kingsbane Rogue, it does well enough that it still finds its way into Tier 1. The power level of Even Warlock is fairly high, as the ability to cheat out giants and summon other overstatted minions earlier than intended is really strong. Even Warlock is a deck that stands to only get stronger as new tools are added to Wild and will abuse the Gen Greymane upgraded hero power for as long as Blizzard allows it. Even Warlock has a good matchup against decks that flood the board with smaller minions and struggle to play around its removal, such as Odd Paladin. It also does well against decks that can't deal with the Warlock's pressure, such as slower forms of Warlock. Even Warlock struggles to compete with decks that have an easy time dealing with its threats, or can repeatedly summon large minions. Big Priest is a prime example of both of these things. The only new deck in this edition of the Meta Snapshot is Exodia Paladin. Due to there being less even shaman and odd rogues, players have been having success with this Paladin archetype. The deck aims to cycle aggressively to reach its combo pieces, and then make use of them alongside Uther of the Ebon Blade's hero power to close out the game. Due to how new the archetype is to Wild, it's hard to accurately place it on the snapshot, but it seems to be more of a niche deck than a highly competitive one currently. If you're looking for something fun and refreshing to play, consider giving Exodia Paladin a try. Tier 2 has quite a few more decks in it than the first tier does. This is due to a lot of decks not being able to compete with Kingsbane Rogue. It's important to see that a lot of these decks might be strong, but due to their bad matchup against the top deck, they struggle to compete as well as the other Tier 1 decks. This is how dominant Kingsbane Rogue is in the Wild meta. That's not to say that these decks are a poor ladder choice, as they can all win games given the right circumstances and pocket metas. Let's take a peek at the top 3 decks of Tier 2. Mind Blast Priest remains the leader of this tier. The deck has a good ability to apply pressure, while setting up for bursts of lethal with Mind Blast. The deck features a lot of mid-range minions, and uses these to fight for board and set the opponent to a low life total. If they manage to stave off the Dragon army, they'll still be met with both Prophet Velen and Mind Blast in order to close out the game. Mind Blast Priest beats these slow decks that lack ways to effectively deal with the pressure and burst, such as Even Warlock. It also does well against Odd Paladin due to all the board clears the priest has access to. One major downside that is preventing Mind Blast Priest from climbing to tier 1 is the deck's bad matchup against Kingsbane Rogue. If Rogue was less popular, it'd be likely for Priest to climb up the tier list. As long as Kingsbane is at the forefront of the meta though, expect it to sit at tier 2. Next up is one of the most discussed decks in Wild, Even Shaman. Many players coming to Wild for the first time may remember a lot of the busted Shaman cards that comprise this deck. While Even Shaman has fizzled out of the standard meta, it's still a real threat in Wild. Even Shaman has a good matchup against Kingsbane Rogue, which is one of the largest reasons for its dominance on ladder. Aside from Rogue, Even Shaman also beats Togwaggle Druid fairly consistently due to the repeated threats the Shaman can summon. In terms of bad matchups, Even Shaman struggles with decks that have access to a lot of removal spells, such as Big Priest and Odd Warrior. These decks can continuously prevent the Shaman from developing a board, thus effectively locking them out of the game. The final deck we'll look at in tier 2 is Cube Warlock. Cube Warlock has a lot of tools to cheat the mana curve by summoning large minions earlier than intended, or without their drawback. This has always been a very abusable tool in Hearthstone, so it's no surprise that Cube Warlock is a good deck. In fact, it bullies decks that can't deal with the pressure from demons or struggle with the consistent board wipes. Decks like Mind Blast Priest and Odd Paladin struggle with these elements, making them good matchups for the Warlock. On the other hand, Cube Warlock can't deal with fast decks that have access to a lot of burn, making Tempo Mage its worst matchup. To counter the meta, a good way to gain an edge is to try to counter as many top decks as you can. The best strategies that you can deploy for this meta would be to either target solely Kingsbane Rogue to maximize your win percentage, or to try to target all the tier 1 decks. While trying to beat all the top decks may seem appealing, if you're only running into Rogue, you should look to go with Plan A. If you're looking to beat Kingsbane Rogue really consistently, we suggest playing Tempo Mage. Tempo Mage is one of the decks that is actually faster than Kingsbane Rogue, and due to the burn damage that the Mage has, it can effectively race them whenever it needs to. Also, the Mage having access to Frostbolts allows for them to prevent the Rogue from attacking on crucial turns. If you wish to try to target all the decks in tier 1, then you should look towards playing Odd Warrior. While the deck finds itself on the lower end of tier 2, it has decent matchups against the majority of the top decks. It's important to note that the deck can be hard to pilot at times, especially in some complex matchups, but if played properly, you will yield results. In conclusion, the Wild meta continues to adapt and shifts around frequently to answer the top decks. Hopefully, the meta will change alongside the release of Rise of Shadows, but it's impossible to know for sure. We can only wait and look forward to seeing the new card's impacts on the Wild meta. We hope you enjoyed the final Wild meta snapshot breakdown of the Year of the Raven. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to keep up with our latest Hearthstone content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the new year.